I'm John Seacott, Executive Editor of the Brewer Magazine. Welcome to another edition of the Brewer Magazine podcast. Hey, make sure that you're following and subscribing both on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're getting your podcasts. And of course, you can always find our updates on business resources of all kinds at brewermag.com. Well, we're diving in to the very essential topic today of water management in brewing. Why is your water's quality a cornerstone of great beer? And what are some great practices that you should be following? Plus, we're also going to talk about that often overlooked importance of effluent management. Yeah, we're going to get into that nitty gritty and dirty stuff. And we want to make sure that all breweries are meeting regulatory standards while staying environmentally responsible. And we're joined with Larry Horwitz of Crooked Hammock Brewing, Director of Operations. Larry, thanks for joining us in talking about water.
Hey, John, great to be back here with you on the podcast. Are we calling it a podcast or is it a vlogcast? I can't keep up with the language these days.
Right? I'm calling it video podcast, but yeah, vlog. It was funny because I started vlogging I on MySpace in 2006 and 7. Never thought that it would continue to be what it is, and here we are. I don't want to count the years now. I can't do math that fast, but
we can. It hurts like it hurts in my elbow, right?
From my days of high school sports vlogging to talking about beer, talking about the main component of it, which is water, and why water profile is so important to the quality of your beer. You would think that this would be the no duh situation, but it seems that sometimes people are still learning about it. And why is it so important to continue to learn even whatever you think you know about your water?
Well, I mean, water is 96 to 98% of even the strongest beer, right? So, as a constituent ingredient, it's enormous. And, the famous beer academic, Dr. Michael Lewis, said something years ago when I was in a room with him that I thought was really poignant and relevant. He's like, water's really just about your only local ingredient. Right? We're a group of people who I think cares about the planet and sustainability and trying to be responsible about using local product when we can. Not all of us, but a lot of us. And the water that we use comes from nearby, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, I mean, the makeup of the water is relevant. I think we all kind of have an understanding that water is not just H2O, right? Because most of the water that we drink or consume in America comes out of some sort of storage spot, whether that's a limestone aquifer in the upper Midwest, near where you guys live, or whether it's coming out of surface rivers and streams or reservoirs. It's coming in contact with the earth, usually in some form or another. And water, of course, is nature's magic solvent that's dissolving whatever it's touching and bringing it along with it. We're also fortunate that in America, the water's regulated. So the EPA says, hey, we have drinking water standards, and all water has to be, for consumption, has to be safe to drink demonstrably, and it has to have some characteristics around it that help us ensure that it's not just safe to consume, but also it has what the water departments call aesthetic characteristics, right? It looks good, smells good. And of course, it's almost all sanitized in the United States, either by direct addition of chlorine or chlorine through chloramination. So, I think we're really fortunate as an industry to mostly have access to really beautiful, tasty water. But if we don't have it, we're screwed. Also, the other half of making beer is cleaning. And then when I say the other half, that's the first and the second halves, right? And there's a third half in there somewhere around recipe development and raw goods acquisition. And I know that's 1.5 halves, but if you don't exactly. And if you don't have good water for cleaning, that's going to jam you up too, right? I made beer for a very long time in the upper Midwest where the water was hard. And when I say hard, I mean like 300 plus parts per million is calcium carbonate. And that actually creates physical problems in some brewing plants. Hot liquor tanks scale up. You get the accumulation of enough calcium scale in some of your tanks and some of your pumps to actually impede their operation. But we're fortunate at the Hammock to have access to really great, mostly surface water and a little bit of groundwater.
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to what you guys are doing, and what everyone should be doing, are there have to do tests when you're taking water coming in from your source and kind of what is the SOP for you guys when it comes to testing water, making sure you're within the parameters that are continuous, and how are you working with your city or your county to be able to find that standard and continue it so that you are making consistent beer at the same time?
John, that's a great question. So I think first we got to recognize the idea that when we talk water, we're also talking effluent usually. So in most municipalities, water in and water out are managed by the same organization, right? Not exactly the same departments in those organizations. So when we're testing water, we're looking for a couple of things. First of all, incoming water, we're looking for chlorine, because chlorine is the thing that in the United States we mostly use to sanitize our water, and chlorine's not great for making beer, right? We carbon filter all of our water, and I think that's really important because it cleans the flavor up a little bit, keeps us from having chloramine problems or phenol problems in finished beer. It also makes it a little bit easier for us to clean. And it definitely causes some challenges. We have to maintain carbon beds and carbon filtration, but we're also looking for alkalinity and mineral content, right? The mineral content and the alkalinity will impact the way the water gets used in our process. But I'm not a huge proponent of making enormous changes to the water we bring in, based on the idea that I talked about early on, that it is a local ingredient.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we make the same beers in a few different places. So for some of our brands, we need to make adjustments. We need to add some mineral or take some mineral away. Taking mineral away is very difficult. We do not reverse osmosis filter beer. But sometimes we will heat and rest water to pull out calcium and calcium carbonate specifically. But for the most part, we're adding either a little bit of organic acidity, either lactic, food grade lactic, or food grade phosphoric acid, or we're adding a little bit of mineral, mostly that contains calcium. And when we add mineral, it's usually one of two minerals, right? Calcium sulfate or gypsum, which tends to increase flintiness and dryness, and calcium chloride, which tends to do almost the opposite. It increases the perception of fullness and sweetness, depending on the use levels, right? And of course, what we're trying to get there is calcium. Calcium is an enzyme cofactor for production. Calcium pretty much makes everything in making beer better, easier, more efficient. But you can't get calcium alone. It's got to come into our process as a salt. So it always carries with it some other mineral or some other element. And the second half of that salt really impacts the flavor. So we're thoughtful and careful about how we use that. But we routinely monitor the alkalinity and the mineral content of the incoming water and just make adjustments to try to normalize that so that we can hit the right pHs in the mash, especially a little bit in our kettle, but mostly so that we're flavor matching, right? We want to change the way the water tastes, not a lot, just enough to make sure that the New England IPA that I make in South Carolina tastes like the New England IPA that we make in Lewis, Delaware, and in Middletown, Delaware, and then hopefully soon in Raleigh, Durham, and in Charleston, where the water sources are similar but not identical. And so that's how kind of we approach it. First, we relatively routinely test for chlorine because that tells us when our carbon beds need attention. Water mineral, we don't do so often. We'll send that out once or twice a year. That's third-party analysis. I can titrate for alkalinity in-house. We don't need to do that much. We notice shifts in the water seasonally because we get shifts in the mash pH, right?
Yep.
I think we're all really fortunate that our malt suppliers, especially if we're using major market malt, they're good at what they do, and the malt is so well made and enzymatically powerful. As long as our water isn't way in the outlying regions of horribly alkaline or full of mineral, that we're going to get the pH we need in the mash, and it can be tweaked and adjusted slightly with a little bit of acid and a little bit of calcium. For our cleaning water, we're less worried about that. I mean, I like the chlorine removed for reasons that we already discussed, but behind that, as long as the mineral is not too high, we're in good shape. We would use softened water to clean the brewery, but we don't. We soften water for the dish machines because honestly, and I think people don't think about this much in a brew pub, but the kitchen and the bathrooms in the restaurant use more water and have more effluent challenges than we do in the brewery.
Sure.
Almost every single person that comes to a brewery restaurant will go to the bathroom at least once. And, we've all spent a lot of time standing in front of urinals or sitting on the toilet, and, it's 3.8 liters per flush in our men's room. And, if you come to eat or drink here and you use the facilities twice, you've now consumed more water than you will for drinking 3 pints of beer. And that includes the water that it took to make those 3 pints of beer, which I think we all kind of know is not 1-to-1, right? I think we're somewhere between 6 and 7 to 1 right now, clean water to production volume. We have separate meters in our brewery and 2 of our locations, so I can see those numbers, which is pretty great. On the effluent side, we're a little more attentive, and as a matter of fact, some of the municipalities require us to test our effluent. Lewis, Delaware, famously is one of those locations, and that's not difficult, and it's also fair of them to ask. I know that we put some stuff down the drain from time to time that's not great for them, and they either want to know it's coming or they want us to be cognizant about the rate at which we let it leave. Both to maintain the city sewer lines and to make sure that the wastewater treatment plant has the right tools to do their job. So we test pH and total dissolved solids and dissolved oxygen, a couple other things in our effluent once in a while, and we report it out. And that has become a best practice for us. Not the testing of it, but the way we manage our effluent because of that. We're required to provide clean outs of our sewer lines in almost all of our locations. And from time to time, the government actually comes and does full-time monitoring. I know some people get twitchy about regulatory agencies, but we want to be good citizens of the places where we live and work. So for us, we think it's relevant and important, and we don't mind that oversight because we want to be a good citizen. Right? We want to make sure we're doing the right thing for the wastewater treatment plant. I think Sam has famously talked about the wastewater treatment plant in Milton, Delaware, which is tiny Eisenhower era facility, and the special challenges that brewery specifically, who's right up the street from me now, has had around that, and he's one of the people that helped me understand what it means to be a good citizen in relation to wastewater. Right.
Sure. There are a lot of small breweries, a lot of breweries that don't understand their water treatment that much. What are some of those monitoring things that maybe, I'm sure once they're open and stuff, they get to see it and learn, but are there things, if someone's in the process of opening a brewery right now, watching this, what do they have to look forward to? What is some of those, either it's tools or equipment that have to be on hand that they're maybe not even thinking about yet?
Well, I think everybody has an idea what the basic tools are for brewing. But commercial water presents just a couple of unique challenges. First, I would say you got to have a pH meter, a good one that is very accurate to the tenths and like plus or minus 3 thousandths. You need to understand how it works, keep calibrated, and track your pH, right? I think that one of the biggest things that making beer over and over again, and especially in a pub or taproom environment, gives us the benefit of is we get to see that mash pH. I'm going to pick on the mash pH. We get to see that mash pH number repeatedly, right? If you have a good pH meter, and record keeping is another great quality tool, right? If you're keeping good records and you're looking at those records, you're going to notice if there's a shift, right? Now that shift might be raw good malt, raw good hops, but it could also be raw good water. And I know that I ran a brewery for a long time where the water changed intentionally twice a year, in the spring and the fall, right? And we could see that in our mash pH. It would shift, and we would then change the water mineral makeup slightly, right? We would decrease our water mineral additions and increase our acid additions. Another thing is to use the ASBC, the American Society of Brewing Chemists, titration recommendations for beer, for beer acidity and for water, right? You want to know what the alkalinity and the hardness of your water is, and if you don't feel like doing that work yourself, which I totally understand, send it out, right? Send the water out and do it routinely. It's not expensive. Even the high-end commercial establishments aren't going to charge more than $100 for a good water analysis, and I just think it's prudent to do that. Also, talk to your water regulator, right? It's funny. Almost every place I've ever made beer, and one of the first things I do is I call up the water department and I say, "Hey, is there somebody in the lab who can talk to me about the water?" And they're either super excited because nobody calls the water department ever, or they're super skeptical because they're worried I'm a reporter and I'm trying to blow them up, right? But once you get across the line of, hey, I care about water, what you do is cool. As a matter of fact, I would love to come tour the plant. Then the conversation changes, right? And they'll be like, hey, I had a water regulator in a location that I won't talk about right now, who was so good. They're like, would it be okay if we called you when we make major changes? And I'm like, yes, it's totally okay. You don't have any obligation to do that, but I would love to know about that, right? And they saved my butt one year because they're like, hey, we're going to be cleaning out major water mains over the next week. And I'm like, that's interesting. I have no idea what that means. They're like, yeah, we go and we open fire hydrants at the ends of long spurs, and we pull, a couple 100,000 gallons of water out of the system. And I was like, well, why would you do that? And they're like, well, nobody knows this, but inside of most main water systems, there's a bit of sludge that settles to the bottom of the pipes over years, and it doesn't negatively impact health or distribution, but they'd like to get it out of the way. And when they do that, they open the end of the line, it stirs up that sediment and gets it out of the way, right? And I think that's a good project. But what it means is that for some periods of time in certain places, the water looks weird, right?
Yep.
And so for us, they would be like, you're probably not going to make beer for the next 2 or 3 days. And I have mixed feelings about that, right? Number one, I'm so glad they called. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Number two, maybe we could plan a schedule for that. And I get it. They're a government bureaucracy that has challenges. They don't always get to choose their timelines. But I think that's something that I would recommend is make friends with your local water department, especially the quality control technicians in their laboratory, right? By the way, people who work in water seem to like beer as much as everybody else. So, if you're showing up for a visit, bring some adult beverages along for testing. Right?
Absolutely. It's funny that you brought that up. I actually just, there's a great Discord channel with brewery people on it. And they just talked about this happened to them last week where they came in, they had, filled the HLT and they looked in it and they're like, what is that? And they finally found out, the fire hydrants have been cleaned out like that and the sludge had shown up. And they're like, now we're cleaning our tanks again and having to, wait a few days to start over. So that's a great tip to if you know ahead of time, even if you can get a slight that even, yes, it is annoying to have to not brew for a few days, but it's better than having to re-clean your tanks after you're already filled up.
So in relation to that, I have 2 more best practice suggestions. Number one, I almost always, if we can pull it off, we'll put a separate water meter in for the main going to the brewery. Municipalities will occasionally let you deduct liquid that goes into making product from your sewer bill. Not always, but you're going to be in a better position if you know how much water is going through the brewery. It also will help you make sure that your carbon beds are getting redone at the right time because you'll have a gallon count, right? I think maybe people don't know this, but carbon has to be replaced in carbon filters on some sort of regular interval, and it's mostly related to how much water went through. And I also tell people that's a great opportunity wherever your water meter or your backflow preventer is for the brewery to put in a clear spun, like 5-micron polypropylene filter house with a filter in it, because you can see the water coming into the brewery. I personally like that filter after the carbon bed, because if the carbon bed has blow by, you'll see it accumulate on the cartridge as well, right? This is, these housings are not expensive. They're hundreds, not thousands of dollars. And if you put a couple of them in parallel in your water line, they also shouldn't slow down your flow or your run rate, but will give you a good look at the water coming into your process, right? You can see if the water's all of a sudden sludgy, muddy, and brown. You're going to literally see it. And I like to put those filters somewhere where people walk by every day. Sometimes they become wallpaper and you won't notice it. But eventually somebody will look at it and be like, hey, that's supposed to be clear. and it's not. But that's I tell everybody who I train to make beer, if something's different, pay attention, right? This is different. If the noise changes or the color changes or the clarity changes, something's going on. It may not be important, but in this case, it could be really important. And there's a $300 add to your brewery construction project that could potentially save you sewering thousands and thousands of dollars worth of beer, right? Because I'm sure the brewery that you speak of that ran into that sludge is like, not only do we have to re-clean our tanks, but did we use any of that water to make anything?
Yeah.
And what are the implications of that? And that can lead to some really difficult conversations inside and outside of your organization, right? Where you're like, hey, I know we have distributor obligations, but unfortunately we've got to ditch some beer that we would have otherwise sold to you because, well, it's just not meeting our specifications. At least I hope people have the courage. I hope people have the courage to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to finish up with one last question, and this one is just about in the brewing and water chemistry pieces. That in your years, and we're not going to count the years again. We don't want to make. You've been around. You've done this for a while. What are the most common mistakes in water profile chemistry that you have learned that is, or maybe it's just changed over the years because of how beer has been made? Like, what are some of those things you're like, man, why did I do that before?
It's the same problem as always. There's people who don't take the time to do the math and are just like, well, if I'm making pale ale at some gypsum is required. So how many glugs or scoops am I going to use? I don't know. Look, there's a guy named Palmer out there who I think all of your listeners will be familiar with, and he's
Heard
written
of
a series of really, a little bit good guy, smart as a whip. He's written a couple of great books, including one about water. I say buy it, put it on your shelf. Also look for the water calculators online and do send your water out. And once you know what the numbers are or what the average analysis looks like, take the time to do the math, right? It's not terribly complicated to do it. And the number one problem I see is that people are just like, well, either I don't understand it, I don't have the time to understand it, or I don't care to understand it. And then they run and gun, right? And I'm like, some calcium, as we've established, is good for beer all the time. So adding some gypsum, calcium sulfate, or calcium chloride to your beer is probably fine. And if it's relatively small quantities, it's probably not going to jam you up. But I like to control my destiny a little more than that. And so for me, the biggest change was realizing that there were relatively inexpensive tools available to help that, and that it's a math problem, right? Like there's a knowable outcome. And I think some people who run taproom breweries and brew pubs also get a pass because, well, flavor memory is fast and loose, and people don't really remember what that beer tasted like last year. So if it changed this year, as long as it's still delicious, and I have great faith in our brethren in the brewing industry, then it's not going to matter that much. But if you're trying to be consistent and turn out the same product over and over again, especially if, like me, you have to manage production at multiple zip codes, it's worth the time. And it's not that hard. Almost all of the software on the market that we're using to help us with formulation has got a module in it. You just got to figure out what's in your water and figure out which of the 3 or 4 available items that you're going to use to modify the water for your needs. And if it's working, don't mess it up. Right?
Yeah.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are a couple of beers we make where we make no water additions, right? We use the water as the municipality intended us to, other than removing the chlorine. We always remove the chlorine. But I've also worked in plenty of breweries where we didn't have the ability to do that, and the beer was plenty fine. Right?
Yeah, the technology is there. Make sure you're using it. That's the important
exactly.
part.
Just be intentional, right? And if you don't choose to be intentional, I would say don't necessarily lose sleep over it, but understand that you're allowing serendipity to push the quality needle in your brewery a little bit. And if you're okay with that, I can support your move there. But if you feel like you're having a challenge, lean in a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, Larry, I appreciate you taking the time to dig into some water with us.
John, always great to chat. Please enjoy the beautiful fall weather we're having.
Don't forget, you can always check on brewermag.com. You can also see us on YouTube and listen to us on Spotify. And don't forget daily updates on Facebook, Instagram, and X. I'm Executive Editor John Seacott for brewermagazine.com.